This is the BFG, written by Roald Dahl, published by Puffin Books. This recording is not for commercial purposes. Okay, welcome to the second part of the BFG, written by Roald Dahl and read by Mr Dallinger. I'm going to read the next two chapters, chapters 5 and 6. This next chapter is called the BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he really is going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I's hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I's a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every bone cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamorly flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of Turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering, with a bit of a tremble, what all this talking about eating people was leading to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar joke and this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavours. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats." "Why hats?" Sophie said. "You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle." "Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. "You is trying to change the subject," the giant said sternly. "We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable." "Oh, but the bean is a vegetable," Sophie said. "Not the human bean," the giant said. "The human bean has 2 legs and the vegetable has no legs at all." Sophie didn't argue any more. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. "A human bean," the giant went on, "is coming in dillions of different flavours. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales." "You means Wales?" Sophie said. "Wales is something quite different." "Wales is Wales," the giant said. "Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue," the giant said. "Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans." You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I's a freaky giant. I's a nice and jumbly giant. I's the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. Next chapter is called The Giants. But if you were so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do, Sophie said. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the bunkum house, or with all those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodile dillies. Sophie knew what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG. Most likely on the telly-belly bunkum box and a radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh, no, cried Sophie. Oh, yes, said the BFG. I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end. I've shown you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you." The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous, tall figures moving among the rocks about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were. Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing," said the BFG. "They's just moochling and foochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG. "But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places like Wellington for the booty flavour and Panama for the hatty taste. Every giant is having his own favourite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often," said the BFG. "They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of cod scallop." "I'm not sure I quite know what you means," Sophie said. "Meanings is not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right." "And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" Sophie asked. "All of them is guzzling human beings every night," the BFG answered. "All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you. You will be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie all in one dollop." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" asked the BFG. "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle," cried the BFG. "All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They's all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness." "Twice as high as you," cried Sophie. "Easily that," said the BFG. "You is seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles and cockles alive-o. I is the titchy one. I's the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country." "You mustn't feel bad about it," Sophie said. "I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages." "Bigger," said the BFG, looking pleased. "They's as big as bubble hammers." "How many giants are there out there?" Sophie asked. 9 altogether," answered the BFG. "That means," said Sophie, "that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive." "More," said the BFG. "It's all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling full up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, And usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked. All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or other, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee North to get himself an Esquimau or 2 to cool him down. A nice fat Esquimau to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it is a frosty night and a giant is fridging with cold, he will probably point his nose towards the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots a cold giant up like a hot Hottentot, the BFG said. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like a whiffswiddle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers, and down you go like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. That's the end of that chapter. Come and listen to the next chapter next time.